Between 1939 and 1945, Australia went through an extraordinary transformation. In 1939, it was an xenophobic enclave of Anglo-Celtic culture, isolationist and suspicious. 6 years later, it was poised on the edge of a post-war immigration boom that was to irrevocably change this nation, a boom that helped establish Australia as something approaching a true multicultural nation. World War II had a lot to do with it by exposing Australia to international pressures, but the change was inadvertently accelerated by one man, an unstoppable religious Jew from Russia, a former member of Lenin's cabinet, who wanted to create a Jewish homeland in the Kimberley. What followed was a weird collision of the exotic and the laconic. The Australians didn't know what hit them, but he helped turn a nation around. Dr. Isaac Nachum Steinberg had survived Russia at a time of revolution. The Australians were pussycats by comparison. Steinberg wanted to save the Jews. Instead, he helped change a nation. This is a remarkable tale about Australia, the Jews, and a retired revolutionary. It's a story about the intersection of character and history, about how this country came close to changing the course of history when it considered establishing a Jewish homeland in the remote Kimberley region of northwest Australia. A curious, even Catholic alliance of intellectuals, clergymen, businessmen, union leaders and politicians, including the West Australian government, urged Canberra to set up a colony for Jewish refugees in the northwest several years before the creation of the State of Israel. This would have been the greatest single land development in Australian history. And just as settlers made the wilderness areas of Israel bloom, proponents of the Kimberley scheme say their project would have transformed thousands of miles of empty wilderness into rich farming and grazing land, as well as developing cities and ports. All of this, it was said, without any cost to the Australian taxpayer. So where does this tale begin? Probably as far back as 1903, when the British offered the Jews a homeland in the colony Uganda. The Zionists rejected the offer, but the movement split 2 years later when a small group of dissidents who refused to rule out the Uganda option formed the Jewish Territorial Organisation. Now, unlike the Zionists, who regarded Palestine as the only place for a Jewish homeland, the Territorialists, led by the Anglo-Jewish writer Israel Zangwill, were prepared to settle anywhere. For many years, the organisation negotiated unsuccessfully with governments around the world over potential settlement areas in such far-flung regions as Angola, Brazil, Canada, and curiously, in Cyrenaica, an historic region in what's now known as Libya. Support for the territorialists faded with the Balfour Declaration, but the movement was revived in the 1930s with the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and Britain, restricting migration to Palestine. Thus, on the 26th of July 1935, several Jewish groups in London established the Freeland League for Jewish Territorial Colonisation. Unlike the early territorialists, the League did not expressly demand autonomy. Its main priority was to find a haven for Jewish refugees before it was too late, some sparsely populated part of the world where it could place Jews who could subsequently enjoy cultural and religious freedom. Unlike Zangwill's movement, it eschewed any call for political independence, preferring instead a culturally distinct settlement flourishing within the political and economic framework of a host nation. And as long as that nation was free and democratic, and as long as the area was large and suitable soil and climate, and a sparse population to avoid any friction between the settlers and established inhabitants as had occurred in Palestine, the League was interested. Australia, with its vast open spaces and Westminster democracy, seemed ideally placed. In 1936, the League wrote to the Deputy Prime Minister and Trade Minister Earl Page requesting talks about suitable areas for settlements and promising financial support from England, the USA and France. It also approached the Australian High Commissioner in London, but that came to nothing. The concept of establishing a new Jerusalem in Australia was to resurface in 1938 through the efforts of an Australian journalist in London, one C.H. Chomley, who was campaigning to populate the northwest, which had a minimal white population and was therefore in the logic of a time, empty. Chumley wanted British migrants to settle there, but his writings failed to ignite the empire-building spirit. He then proposed that it be turned over to the persecuted Jews of Europe. The Freeland League seized on the idea, and the organisation secured its foothold when the pastoral firm Connor, Doherty and Durack offered the would-be settlers some 16,500 square kilometres in the Kimberley, stretching from the north of Western Australia into the Northern Territory. This unpromised land, with its semi-arid, blood-red landscape, didn't exactly flow with milk and honey, but the Freeland League thought it was perfect. It was an area bigger than Belgium, 7 million acres for about 75,000 Jewish refugees, people who would abide by the laws of Australia but who would bring into the region some of Europe's best scientists, engineers and technicians to develop the region. All of this would be bankrolled by the Freeland League, and, unlike Palestine, the land was so sparsely populated and underdeveloped there was little chance of antagonising the few people that lived there. Apparently, the Aboriginal inhabitants didn't count, even if the land was like the breath of their body and the beat of their heart. Now, legally, the land belonged to Connor, Doherty and Durack, which had been keen to offload the property since the bottom fell out of the beef market in the 1930s. The main stumbling block was the Commonwealth's migration laws, which opposed mass migration of any one particular ethnic group. However, after some lobbying by the owner of the property, Michael Durack, the government told him it wouldn't stand in the way of transferring his holdings to any persons or interests of British nationality. Now, the Freeland League was based in Britain, and it promptly wedged its foot in the door, which the government had left ajar. So, in 1939, the League sent its secretary, Dr. Isaac Steinberg, to Australia to sell the idea to Canberra and the public. It was a big ask, given the conservative and xenophobic nature of Australian society at the time. But Steinberg had much experience juggling politicians and bureaucrats, and at the age of 29, he'd been the first Commissar of Justice in Lenin's cabinet when the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, but he had fled the Soviet Union when his party, the Social Revolutionaries, fell out with the Communists. Born in Latvia in 1888, Steinberg was by all accounts a remarkable man. He'd been a member of the first Bolshevik-dominated cabinet, yet he was a deeply religious and observant Jew who prayed every day, he kept kosher, and he wore tefillin. Indeed, while he was a cabinet member, meetings were said to be held on Sundays so that he would not break the Sabbath by rioting. For his doctorate of law, he examined criminal law in the Talmud, analysing such concepts as free will and the responsibilities of both groups and individuals. Steinberg was a skilled politician. He spoke 7 languages. He was equipped with a tremendous force of personality and a blistering intelligence. Combine that with the vision by which he was driven, and it was easy to see why the High Commissioner's office in London warned the Australian government that this man was, in their words, known to be a clever propagandist. Steinberg nevertheless received his visa and he landed in Fremantle in April 1939, and after meeting with the WA Premier Mr John Wilcock, he set out on a 3-week mission to investigate the area, accompanied by members of the Durack family and agricultural scientist George Melville. Steinberg and Melville were enthusiastic about what they saw. They compiled an ambitious report which envisaged Jewish refugees taming the wilderness by establishing farms for livestock and growing crops. These, they said, would provide raw materials for secondary industries such as tanning, canning fruits and vegetables, manufacturing jams, leather products, mats and bricks. The settlers, they said, would dam rivers, including the Ord. They would build scientific and hydroelectricity stations. Here was an agricultural miracle that would not only populate the north, but also boost exports, create new exports, and stimulate economic growth. Steinberg assured the state government that it had nothing to fear about the loyalty of the refugees, claiming the settlement would enjoy complete religious and cultural autonomy, but follow Australian laws, including those for taxation, defence and education. More importantly, he guaranteed the League would pay for everything. Steinberg's writings at the time waxed lyrical about the opportunity for a total rebirth in a world free from the age-old hatreds of Europe, a world where settlers would write Jewish poems about the kangaroo and the kookaburra. And he wrote, "Yet their voice would be the voice of Israel, and the sigh of her songs would be Jewish. Is it not clear then that in such teeming life of young and old, Jewish life would again organically arise? Folk songs, natural wit and wisdom would be born out of all this toil. Jewish happiness and sorrow, Jewish memories and dreams would be spontaneous in such a settlement. Jewish religiousness and liberal thought, the quest after the divine, and the longing for justice on earth, all would thrive on Kimberley soil, just as they had thrived in many lands. Now, Steinberg's proposal struck a nerve with the Australian public, particularly in Western Australia. For the Northwest had always troubled Australia. All that space, and they couldn't do a thing with it. The trying climate, the primitive living conditions, and the lack of amenities meant that few white women were prepared to go with their husbands and settle the North. This meant that there were few white workmen who were attracted to the cattle industry there, which in turn resulted in employment of natives and half-caste stockmen and station hands as the Aboriginal tribes were being broken up. But while the tribes and the Aboriginal culture were being wiped out, white settlement was not proceeding. Why, the West Australians had even established a Department of the Northwest to sort out this apparent problem, and couldn't. With Australia caught between the contrary demands of colossal isolationism and the myth that we had to populate or perish, the coming of war, and in particular the threat from Japan, made the emptiness of the North a strategic issue. Australians not only wanted settlement that was white, it also had to stop the yellow hordes. They needed something up there, they just didn't want it to be them. So Steinberg's idea came at the right time, even if some people couldn't get their heads around the idea that a bunch of scrawny Jews might succeed where their brawny pioneers had failed. Still, it was a tempting proposition. As one West Australian MP summed up in Parliament when he asked, "Are we going to have Jews or Japs?" They went for the Jews. The proposal was immediately endorsed by the public and the WA government. Writing in the West Australian on the 15th of July 1939, Professor Walter Murdoch said, "Israel's extremity is Australia's opportunity." The stage was set to approach Canberra and get approval for a scheme that could save thousands of lives before the Nazis pulled the noose any tighter. But hopes for a quick decision were dashed on the 1st of September when German tanks rolled into Poland. Now stranded himself, Steinberg realised the Kimberley scheme would have to take a lower priority because the nation was now facing a great crisis. Winning support from the Commonwealth government, which opposed block settlements of aliens and which was sensitive to perceived security risks, was now even more difficult. Steinberg shrewdly set out to lobby prominent and influential Australians, collecting an unusual coalition of supporters which included Labor politicians such as John Cain Sr., Conservatives like Frederick Eccleston, leading businessmen, scientists, judges, media representatives such as the then chairman of the ABC, William Cleary. Other prominent supporters include the former New South Wales Premier and Supreme Court Judge, Sir Thomas Bevan, the Commonwealth Minister for Repatriation, Eric Harrison, the designer of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Dr. John Bradfield. Their views were summed up in an editorial that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 14th of December 1939. It said, "Only by developing and populating this great continent of ours can we justify our right to hold it in a land-hungry world." Steinberg's greatest allies were the Church and the unions. The Church, which saw the saving of refugees as a truly Christian deed, called on the government to fulfil its moral obligations and endorse the scheme. Supporters included Archbishop Daniel Mannix, the Primate of Australia Archbishop Henry Lefanu, the Archbishop of Sydney, Dr. Howard Mao, the Bishop Coadjutor of Sydney, Charles Van Pilcher, and the Moderator General of the Presbyterian Church, Robert Macaulay. And for their part, the unions saw the scheme as a potent blow in their fight against fascist ferocity. During this period, there was widespread debate, most of it in editorials and letters pages of newspapers. While the scheme had many supporters, others believed it would fail. Some believed it would spark racial tensions, while others just rejected it because they didn't like non-Anglo-Celtic migrants. The Bulletin on the 24th of January 1940, for instance, warned of Jews swarming into the cities, quote, "even if they have to burrow under wire netting." But the most vehement critics were the local Jews themselves. Only a fraction of the established Jewish population in Australia supported the scheme. The established Anglo-Jewish community leaders, fearing that a sudden influx of migrants arriving en masse would unsettle the racial balance, were generally, with some exceptions, opposed to the scheme. For example, in September 1939, following the outbreak of war, the Victorian Jewish Advisory Board President and Member of Parliament, Mr. Archie Michaelis, was unenthusiastic about the proposal to save his brethren. We have our hands full in looking after the migrants already, he told the press. If the Kimberley venture should fail through any cause, it would obviously be impossible to absorb settlers in capital cities. The most virulent opposition, however, came from the Zionist leaders, who feared that any attempt to put Jewish pioneers in the Australian wilderness would, by siphoning away resources, undermine efforts to do the same in Palestine. In his memoirs, Sydney Zionist leader Max Freilich said the territorialists were among the greatest enemies of the wartime Zionist cause. Writing in the Jewish press, his Melbourne counterpart, Dr. Aaron Patkin, criticised those he described as Gentile dreamers and idealists, and those somewhat lacking in political wisdom and responsibilities. In one interview, one leader, Mr. Alec Maisel, told me that the scheme was too dangerous an alternative because the British were playing a double game, and there was a concern that they would deny the Jews a homeland in Palestine if they had one in the Kimberley. By the time Steinberg approached the Commonwealth government in August 1940, his scheme had attracted substantial publicity and public support. But the proposal was at odds with the government's policy not to encourage block settlements of non-English-speaking migrants. The government also feared Australia would be unable to absorb the refugees if the colony collapsed, and it was reluctant to support the proposal. It subsequently informed Steinberg that any decision had to be postponed. It was too busy fighting a war. Undeterred, Steinberg made a second approach when the Curtin government took office late in 1941, but again, the government refused to commit itself. And then, in 1944, the government informed Steinberg that the proposal had been rejected in view of the long-established policy regarding alien settlement in Australia. The Sydney Morning Herald condemned the government, and the West Australian newspaper wrote, "The amiable thesis that all men are created brothers seems to be accepted in high places. There is little evidence that it extends to the cruelly persecuted race of European Jews." Steinberg himself refused to admit defeat. He continued to lobby the government to reverse its decision, heartened by the findings of a 1944 Gallup poll, which found that 37% of Australians favoured a Jewish settlement. But despite calls from Steinberg's supporters, including the ACTU, to reverse the decision, the government stuck to its guns. What little chance there was of a Jewish colony in Australia evaporated in 1948 with the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel. Steinberg died in New York 9 years later. In retrospect, he probably never had a chance of getting his scheme off the ground. Material from the government archives suggests there were concerns that the settlement would create a state within a state. There also appear to be concerns that it would have compromised Australia's security, perhaps by laying the groundwork for a fifth column in an isolated part of Australia. It had also been suggested that Steinberg's own political pedigree might not have helped. There are also serious questions as to whether this scheme would have worked or not. There are questions as to whether it would have collapsed within a generation, in addition to the doubts about its long-term economic viability. Putting Jews in such a vast and isolated area may well have resulted in many of them drifting into the cities, where their children could mix with other Jews. Then there are questions as to whether the Freeland League would have had the resources to bankroll the scheme. Because the scheme never came to fruition, it remains one of the great imponderables of his curious tale. Nevertheless, the Kimberley scheme was a significant development because it highlighted issues which helped shape Australia's post-war development. The Kimberley scheme and the influx of migrants during the 1930s were the backdrop to a more general debate on immigration. The debate about the merits of a Kimberley scheme was centred on questions about what kind of nation Australians wanted to build. And it was this very debate that helped pave the way for the post-war migration boom which changed the face of Australia forever. The unfinished Kimberley episode is part of a much broader story in the development of a nation. It is one that takes on a deeper resonance in the chilling political developments in Australia today, and those events only serve to remind us how fragile such developments can be.